think we should be good. So anyway, what we were doing, we were listening to this ping pong delay. So we were looking at the examples page. So that's the ping pong delay. And now looking at the ping pong delay on the API, we can see the code and we can hear another example of that. Is that all going through?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's the examples, that's the API. Let's go back to the examples. So there's a bunch of other stuff in here that have different interactive stuff. So if we want to just look at a basic synth, you can play notes on the synth. You can actually plug in a MIDI keyboard here and it'll work. And then there's also synth parameters. So this is a really good way to play with how things sound. It's sort of like the Three.js editor, because when you're writing code, it's not always going to work exactly right. If you want to make sure that it's working and just see how things sound, you can look at the parameters in these examples. So for example, with the synth, the detune parameter is going to detune by a certain amount. So if we detune by a lot, it's going to sound very low. And if we detune up, it's going to sound higher. So that's kind of fun. There's also like volume, there's an envelope, so you can change the overall envelope, which I'll talk a little bit more about what the envelope does later. Then there's the general oscillator pattern, which is another thing that we'll have to talk about a bit, just like some more general music related stuff that's not necessarily coding. But we can change the different oscillator types. So this is like a sine wave. If we want to do a square wave, that'll change the sound a little bit. There's other stuff that we can change that we'll go over. But yeah, there's a lot of different parameters that are related to all these different things. So like another thing that you might look at is like another type of synth. Let's look at like the metal synth. Oh, they didn't give us any parameters for this one. Let's look at polysynth. Here we go. Okay. This is actually pretty similar. But anyway, you can see that there's parameters here, and then they also have these little brackets will show you the code for those parameters. So you can copy those and stick them directly into your code. So if you are going for a certain sound and you play around with it on here until you get it right, you can just copy those parameters and put it into your project. So all these have like default parameters, and there's a lot of different parameters. So you can spend kind of a lot of time. Like if I go to the API, these are all the different parameters, and so you can spend a lot of time like learning about how these different things work. It can be a little overwhelming working with audio because there's just a lot of different choices and different options. But you can start simple and start to look at different things that may sound cool. So those are the examples. And then we looked at it this briefly last time, but there's also like this whole page of demos. So this is another place to look if you're, just kind of curious, like what can I do with this stuff? You can look at some of these different demos, and usually you can look at the code because the demos are, submitted to the website. So they're supposed to be like good examples of how to use the code. This one seems to be loading slowly. I wanted to look at this one last time, but it never loaded. I wonder I think this one loaded fast. Oh no, this is like some spam. This is weird. Um, what about this first one? Okay, so yeah, this is a bunch of different Chrome demos. Let's look at this one. So this is kind of cool. You're just like drawing stuff and then it's playing, I guess, like interpretations of what you drew with different samplers. Um, and let's see, does it show us the code for this? It doesn't have a button to see the code, but let's see if we can see it in here somewhere. Okay, let's look in the sources. Okay, so we can't actually see this code, but at least it's good for some inspiration. Anyway, that's some demos. So that's one place to kind of like learn about how Tone works. Another place that I have found is really useful is the Tone GitHub, where you can look at the code, but there's also a wiki here. So there's a bunch of examples on the homepage that show you how to do stuff. But then there's also a wiki, which has a lot of different resources, but it also has really good explanations of how things work because they're not always completely intuitive. So there's a whole page just on installation that shows different configurations and stuff like that. But then there's things on like the transport, which is kind of complicated. We'll go over that probably next time. Um, Different types of instruments and how they work, different types of effects and how to set them up. And yeah, there's some basic tutorials. Like this one on time is really good for understanding like the different syntax that it uses to think about time. So there's a lot of stuff in here like using tone is hard because it's not just knowing the code, but we also have to understand a certain stuff about how we talk about and think about music and generating music. So I'll try to do my best to kind of do quick explanations of things, but there's a lot of stuff in here that will kind of help explain those things. There's a glossary here that kind of explains all these different terms that you'll see for the different synths and their parameters and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff in here that will be useful to look at. I will obviously link to all of this stuff um, in the video for this. But let's just get started with some basics. So we've seen a few things about how to use different things. So what I want to do now is I just want to show a really basic synth and how you actually use it. Because it may not be like the most, it might not be the most sort of like obvious thing. So what we're going to do, we'll just look at these kind of basic examples. So once we've initialized, we've set everything up, we're running Tone, now we can actually start to create some stuff. So I'm going to start here. I'm just going to create a simple synth and then just play a note. And we'll talk about what's happening in here. So I'm just going to copy this code and throw it in here. And is there a format button? Let's see. Yes. Okay, very nice. And let's see if this works. So once we set everything up, we're creating a synth and connecting it to the main output. Um, and then we're going to play a note, which is the middle C, for a duration of 1/8 note. So if you're familiar with how music is written, usually music is written in sort of like blocks of 4 by 4 meter. Let's actually look up a score real quick. I'm just gonna look up a music score. Let's see. What's a good example? I want something simple.
I have simple stuff in my notebook. I can show maybe.
Oh, really? This is
Yeah, I wrote some stuff, some notes for my drums.
okay. Yeah, if you wanna, if
I
it's
mean, it's different than what you'll find on the internet because you should look for drum notes because it'll be easier to understand it.
yeah, so it'll just be basic uh,
Yeah.
rhythm notation. Um, But I
Hmm.
think okay, I think this is good enough right here to show what I want to show for this. And I'll probably do more. I'll probably show more examples of this. This is just like a very simple musical score. Um, oh, this first line is written in 3/4, which is kind of annoying. Okay, let's skip to here. Okay, so this line is written in 4/4. So most music is written in 4/4. That means there are four uh, beats per measure, essentially. And each one of these sort of dots represents a beat at a different note in the scale. And so in this measure, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 notes, and that's referred to as a quarter note because there are 4 notes that make up this one block. Um, Down here, this is a whole note, and so it's one note that takes up an entire measure or 4 beats. And then here is a half note. So the circle with a line, but it's not filled in, that's a half note, and that means it takes up 2 beats. And the divisions kind of go from there. So a whole note is one whole measure. In this case, it's in 4/4. There's other time signatures, but that'll be confusing. So let's ignore that for now. So a whole note has four quarter notes. And then you can go from there. You could have like, you know, eighth notes, which is two notes in the space of a quarter note. You can have 16th notes, 32nd notes, 64th notes, etc. But you don't get bigger than a whole note. So if you have one whole note and you want to play, a second whole note, that's just another measure. So a whole note is kind of like the longest that one note inside of a measure will last. And then the length of that note is determined by a couple things, like the time signature, how many notes there are in one measure, as well as the beats per minute, or how many how fast the song is playing, the tempo of the song. Um, so the time thing is actually one of the trickier things. Let's go back to the wiki for this. Under time. So they have different ways of referring to time. One is in seconds, like how long do I want this tone to play for in seconds? But then the other is in notes values. So a quarter note is for n standing for note. Then the other notes follow that syntax. So like a whole note would be 1n, a half note is 2n, an eighth note is 8n, and etc. We won't talk about triplets right now. You can also play for a measure that's the same as a whole note. So 2m is two measures, which it would be two whole notes. And then you can also do stuff based on like the number of measures, and then quarter notes and 16th notes. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of write time in here, and it can be a little confusing. But that's basically how the two main ways to do it is using seconds and using notation. And you can also convert between the two. So I can say what would be the seconds value of a quarter note. Um, so that's what where are we? Here we are. That's what this 8n stands for. This C4 is just the middle note on a piano, and the 4 kind of tells us where in the scale we are. So let's look at a piano roll real quick. So let's look at a piano roll with MIDI notes, because that'll help us understand what we're looking at. Um, no, this is not what I want. Let's just say MIDI. Oh, here we go. MIDI notes on a staff is what we want to look at. Okay, so this is a convenient chart to have handy. I might put this somewhere where we have easy access to it. Um, let's just open this image. So this is a piano. I assume most of you guys have seen a piano before. You have all the notes in kind of like Western temperament that are available. And you can see C4 right here is directly in the middle. And so when we say C4, referring to this like middle C. And then we can just kind of go from there. On the left-hand corner, you can see the MIDI numbers that are associated with these notes. And then the black keys are always either sharps or flats. So C4 is this key right here, and then C#4 would be the black key next to it. And usually when we're talking about in tone, we're going to use just sharps rather than sharps and flats. It's a little bit easier. Yeah, so we'll just talk about sharps. So you may not know what any of that stuff means if you've never done like music lessons before, but that's basically the name of the note plus the number tells us where we are on the keyboard. So let's go back here, and we can run this. So if I hit start, hopefully it'll actually play the sound. I didn't hear anything. Maybe I need to rerun the. There we go. Okay. And so you can hear it's a C4, and it's just an eighth note, so it's a relatively short duration. So if I change the 8 to like a 4, it's going to be slightly longer. If I change it to a whole note, it's going to be longer. And if I change it to like, 5M, like 5 measures, it's going to be very long. Although, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing a release as well. So let's just do, we'll come back
But
to that.
it's not the long. It's just how long it lasts. I mean, in a beat, it's like if you put one beat and then just one time for the whole measure.
Right. Yeah. So that's true. So this is the
Won't
duration.
not necessarily be long as like it will be like one beat, and then the next beat will be after three more notes.
Yes, but you can play. Well, so yeah, we'll talk more about how that works when we do like sequencing and stuff like that. But the basic point is that when we do this synth trigger attack release, this first parameter is the note that we want to play, and the second parameter is the duration of the note. But that gets a little bit more complicated in a second. We'll see. But let's change the note first, and we'll see how it sounds. So this is just a middle C. And if I put a little sharp in here, we'll get a C sharp 4. Uh, oh, I have to rerun the sketch and then play it. So you can hear that, it's one whole tone or one half tone above C4. Let's turn this back to a quarter note so it doesn't go so long. And then, obviously I can go up to D4. That'll just sound a whole note above. And if I go to like, C5, that'll be an octave above middle C. So it starts at C0. I don't know if we'll actually be able to hear this because it's probably too low. Okay, I can actually hear it. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but you can hear it's just like a very low sound. And then I forget what the highest MIDI note is. I guess it's an 8. We probably won't be able to hear that. That's going to be too high. I'm not going to even play that. But let's do C6, see what that sounds like. Okay, so that's pretty high. I won't torture you with going higher than that, at least not with this basic synth. Um, so that's kind of how we can control the synth. But let's talk a little bit more about what's happening here, and then we'll continue. So um, I'm not sharing my whole screen right now, so I can't really like draw on this, but I'll try to do an example anyway. So basically, when we're creating a synth in Tone, we always start with Tone, with new Tone. And so just like 3JS, everything is inside of this like Tone object. So all the synths, everything that we see in the API, if we go back to the API, everything that's in here, like the FM synth, the reverb, all of this different stuff is always going to start with tone dot whatever it is. And that's just a JavaScript thing because of the way the browsers is designed and stuff like that. We want to kind of have everything encapsulated inside this tone object so that it doesn't interfere with other stuff that's going on the page. So everything that we do when we want to create something like a synthesizer or a sequencer or an effect or something like that, it's always going to start with whatever we want to call it and then new tone dot and then whatever the thing is. So this thing is a synthesizer, and it's just the default synth. So if we look in the API and we type in, we go to synth, that's the AM synth. Where's the default synth? Okay, I'm gonna go to search and type synth. Here we go. So this is the default synth, and it has some parameters. We'll go over how these things affect the sound a little bit later. But in here, we can see all the different properties. Um, the envelope, frequency, all of this different stuff. And so there's all these options that we kind of bundle together and stick in the synth to create a specific sound. I'm going to go over that on Wednesday because we're going to talk about objects and then talk about how to change these parameters a bit more. But if we want to change the sound, simple thing we can do is just change what we're creating. So I kind of like the FM synth. That's my favorite one out of these. That's what I usually use for my projects. And all I have to do to change the sound is literally just change the name of the synth here. So instead of a default synth, I'm going to create an FM synth. And we can read about what this is. An FM synth is composed of two synths where one synth modulates the frequency of the second synth. So if you've done like audio synthesis, you might know what that means. It probably doesn't really mean that much, but we will hear that it sounds different. So I'm just going to grab this and go back here and paste it in here and run it again. Oh, let's go back to C4. That's too loud or too high. So you can see it sounds a little bit different. It's hard to see the exact difference, but there's a little bit more distortion going on. It has a little bit more of an edge to it. So that's how we create a synth. And then this last bit here, this to destination, this is connecting our synth to our speakers. And the way that Tone kind of thinks about audio is similar to how audio works in the real world. In the real world, you might have like, I'm just going to do like a comment. You might have your kind of music setup where you will have like a keyboard or a synthesizer. So let's say I have a synth, and if I just play the synth, if you've ever sat down at just a keyboard that's not plugged into anything and you hit the keys, you're not going to hear anything. There's no sound that's being created. In order to make sound, we have to send the signal that the synthesizer generates. We have to connect it to some output. So usually that's going to be like a speaker. It might be like a sound system, it might be your computer, whatever it is. In this case, it's just the audio context of the browser. We're connecting the synthesizer to the audio context, and that's what, makes the sound audible for us to hear. Um, we can also connect other things. So sometimes we're just connecting the synth directly to the destination. But when we go over effects and stuff like that, we might connect it to a reverb. So we might say we're going to put the synth into a reverb, and then we're going to put that reverb into a speaker. So if you've done music stuff before, if you're like a guitar player or something like that, you probably have like effects pedals. So you take a line out of your guitar, you plug it into effects pedal, you take another line out of the effects pedal, and that goes into your amp. And so that's how you get the original signal of the guitar plus the effect, and then you get the output out of your speakers. So everything in Three.js is going to look something like this, where we have to connect stuff. Another way of writing the same thing, well, actually, let me get rid of this first, and then we'll see what it sounds like. So I'm going to put this comment up here. Um, so if I get rid of to destination, we're not going to get an error or anything like that because it's still going to work, but we're just not going to hear the result of what the synth is doing. So we don't hear anything. And so the synth is running, it's doing what we asked it to do, but we don't hear anything because we haven't connected it to our output. So that's what we have to do. We can say to destination. And that's a shorthand for, so let's run that again. That's actually a shorthand for connect. So we're connecting the synth to tone.destination. And so the destination is a default in Tone that's going to default to our browser context. You could actually theoretically set it to other things if you were, coding in a different environment. But basically, this is a shorthand for connecting our synth to the destination, which is the speakers or the audio context output. Okay, so I'm going to go over one more thing and then I'll let you guys play around with some stuff. And that's this function here. So this function has a couple parts, and this is like an easy way just to play a note, which is why they have it in the kind of like first part of the tutorial. But this is actually doing two things. So it's saying trigger, attack, and release. And so trigger does kind of what it sounds like. It just triggers an event. So when I hit a key on my keyboard or I hit a button on my sampler or something, that's called a trigger. I'm triggering some event, and that event is going to result in a sound being played or something like that. The attack is the sound starting, and you can hear the sound doesn't just like start at full volume, it goes up, it kind of comes in. And that's what we usually do with synthesizers, because if it just started automatically, we would get this really nasty click. Or sorry, I made some distortion on my mic when I said that. Um, if you just start a sound at full volume, your headphones or your speakers or whatever you're listening to, it's going to go from 0 to full, and that's going to sound really bad. It's going to have this like nasty click. And so we don't do that. We do an attack. So we ramp up our sound from 0 to whatever very quickly. And we can set how long that attack takes, but we don't want to do it immediately. And then we do the same thing on the other side. If we go from 0 to nothing in one frame, it's going to sound really bad. So we do a release. The attack is our sound getting louder, and then release is the sound trailing off. And we can set those values. If we look back at the examples, I should really have all of these open at the same time. If we look at our synth in the examples and we look at the envelope, this is what this is talking about, is the attack and the release. So the attack is this going from 0 to full here, and then this is the release. It's slowly trailing off. So if you hit a key, you can hear it's a very short attack till it gets loud, and then a slow release. So if we increase the attack, now you can hear it's taking a while to get loud. It's going up. Um, and then the release is happening very quickly because we don't have much room for the rest of our release. So this curve we're going to ignore for now, but this kind of changes the way the sound goes. But there's a couple other things happening here. So let's reset this. It was like 0.05. So I'll talk about these curves another time because it's a little more in depth. But every synth has these four parameters: the attack, decay, release, and sustain. And if we look at this visualization and change these values, we're going to see what each one corresponds to. So if I increase the decay, you can see that this slope here is the drop off from the loudest point of the sound to like right here where the ultimate release happens. So the decay is kind of like the how long the sound plays for. And so if I increase the attack a little bit, and then we can see that decay, let's just do 1 for the attack. And then I'll do 5 for the decay. We'll hear what that sounds like. So it's a subtle difference, but you can see that this kind of like main part of the sound is lasting a little bit longer. So let's set this decay back to like 2. So then we have the release. So that is this end part at the back, this little tail here. And that's how long it takes to go to 0. So if we make that release really long, so now it kind of like floats a little bit longer. We can hear the sound longer, but it's trailing off for longer. So let's do the release at 1, and then we have the sustain. So if we make the sustain really big, whoops. Oh, it won't let me do that for some reason. Huh. I guess I can't change the sustain on a synth. Let's try the FM synth. Will they let me change the sustain? Okay, this one is just 1 or 0. Okay, so normally we can have a little bit more fine-tuned control over the sustain, but in this case, the sustain is just how long it sustains the max volume. So here, let's hear the sustain at 0. Oops. And I'm gonna increase the release and the decay a bit so we can hear longer. Okay, so that's the sustain at 0. It immediately starts losing volume after the attack. So then if we change the sustain to 1, you can hear that sound, the full volume of the sound lasts a bit longer. So there's a lot more we can play with here, but those are kind of the basics to start with. So when we do this, a trigger, attack, release, we're triggering the attack and the release at the same time. And we can actually add an optional argument here. So let's go back to our API for a second. Oh, we are on our API. No, this is the examples. Let's go back to the API and let's go to our FM synth. And then we're going to take a look at trigger, attack, release. And so we can see there's actually 2 optional parameters in here. And the documentation notes that by putting a question mark. So we have to have a note to play a note, obviously. We have to have a duration, how long the note should be held. And then we also have an optional time. So we can actually delay the time when the note is played. And then we can change the velocity, which is like how intensely the note is played. So I'm just going to do time for a second. So in this case, we're going to wait for a whole note, and then we're going to trigger a quarter note. I have to run it first. Okay, so you can hear that happening, right? Let's put a log here. So we'll say console.log trigger C4. So then I'll run and start. So you can see the sound starts much later. So this is kind of like a delay, but we're setting the time when we want the attack to start. And then this is really setting the time for when the release should start. So we're not actually setting, the duration of the note. It ends up creating the duration of the note because the note is released. But if we change this, now it's just going to play the note longer before it does the release. So these are really both scheduled times. So we can separate these out. So we can say synth dot trigger attack. And I really don't recommend doing this much because if you start an attack and then you don't release it, it's gonna be bad for your computer. It's gonna be really annoying, and then you have to reload the browser, and it's just never gonna end. But anyway, we can do this here. We can trigger. Let's trigger a C4, and let's trigger. Uh, let's see. So if with trigger attack, it's just the note and when the note should start. And this is a little bit different because when the note should start is not referring to like our measure, but referring to like time in general. Whereas duration can take in a measure. So when the note should start, usually if we want it to start right away, would just be 0, or we could say tone.now, which will give us the current time. So then we want to make sure to trigger a release. We don't want to run this without triggering a release. So we can trigger a release of C4. And here's where we can say tone.now. And the cool thing here is we can just add to this. So we can say plus like 2n, or let's do a second note. Um, and hopefully this doesn't break. I think this is right. No, okay, we broke it. So how do we, I think I might have to convert this to seconds. So I think I might need to say tone dot 2 seconds and then a second note. I thought it would do that by itself, but let's try it. It says tone 2 seconds is not a function, so let's see what it really is. Oh, tone.time. Oh, this is okay. I just forgot this whole thing. Okay, so we need to actually convert this. So we need to say tone.time, second note, dot 2 seconds. So that will do our trigger, attack, and release. Okay, so that didn't work. So we missed something. Let's see. This is tone.now. Let's just try this amount of time and 0 for this. Okay, that's not right. Let's go back and look at the example that they use. So trigger attack with no argument is current time. That should be the same. And this is a quarter note from now. Okay, let's try that. I feel like this should be working. I don't really know why it's different. Oh, but it's not even giving a note, so that doesn't seem right. Let's look at the example over here. Yeah, this is now plus 1. Huh. This is why I don't use this, but let's see. This is exactly, sorry, this is exactly what was written here. Tone.now, now plus 1. Okay. Tone.now. Okay. plus 1. Okay. I don't know why that's not working the way that it says in the documentation. But anyway, what I wanted to show is that we could make this interactive by adding key presses. I think we're kind of running out of time to do that, so we'll do that next time. For now, let's just stick with trigger attack release because this is much safer. We don't have to worry about our, our tone not being released. Um, so let's stick with that for today. What I want you guys to do, we only have a few minutes left, but you can copy this starting code. And then what we'll go over is we'll add more interactivity on Wednesday. We'll go over, we'll get our key presses to work. Um, but you can play with just the trigger attack release for now. And you can play with different synths. So what I want you guys to try to do is just look at the different synths in the API and just see how they sound. And then if you like one, you can, play with these different synths uh, and see how they sound. And then if you like one, replace the synth here. And then on Wednesday, what we'll do is make this interactive. So we'll add some key presses to kind of change what we're playing. But yeah, I think we've covered enough for now. We'll do that on Wednesday. So I'm going to stop recording. I'll see if there's any questions, and then we can play around with